Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off by discussing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, Unrwa, which has said now that it does not have enough cash to survive beyond May, only has enough cash right now to survive till May. Now, there's two main reasons for this. Obviously, one of the main ones is the COVID-19 pandemic itself, and the fact that it's needed to tell about 30,000 of its health workers that they're going to be furloughed to an extent, and or their salaries are not going to be paid in full. Also, one of the other huge reasons is the cut to the U.S. funding to Unrwa. Unrwa, of course, dependent on around 360 million or so US dollars of funding on an annual basis. Its budget for this year is $1.2 billion. It's only right now received about a third of that. It is in talks with other countries and other regions around the world to be able to bridge that gap. Now, Unrwa serves an extremely important function for Palestinian refugees, especially, of course, those who were ousted when Israel was formed many years ago. And so it's been, of course, supporting these Palestinians both within the occupied territories as well as those Palestinian refugees who find themselves outside of the occupied territories in countries like Jordan or otherwise. Let's discuss that further. We're now joined by Khalil Jahshan, who is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., which is an independent think tank focusing on developments in the Arab world and U.S. foreign policy. He's joining us now this morning from Washington, D.C. Khalil, good morning to you. Tell us, what do you think about Unrwa and the function and the purpose it serves at this point? What would it mean if Unrwa is not able to function in the fashion it has for these past years?
Well, Unrwa, as it is known, full name, of course, is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, was established in 1949, to be precise, on December 8th of that year by action from the General Assembly of the United Nations. So it is a function of the United Nations. It's an agency, probably the largest agency at this time of the United Nations. And it was basically assigned to this specific need with the creation of the refugee problem that you just referred to in 1948 to cater to the humanitarian needs, education, health, and otherwise, of the refugees that emerged from that war in 1948. Initially, it was dealing with about 711,000 of those refugees or so. And then, of course, their descendants, the fact that this issue was never resolved since 1948, you're talking about a population today of at least 5.6 million registered refugees that fit the definition of Unrwa and therefore are entitled to its services throughout the Middle East, in Palestine itself, in the West Bank and Gaza, plus neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria.
All right. We're also now joined by Huda Ammori, who is a graduate of the University of Manchester, where she founded and chaired the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Society. She's also coordinated the national BDS campaigns there. She's joining us now from London this morning. Huda, good morning to you, and thank you for joining us. Huda, what do you make of the importance of Unrwa at this point in time for Palestinian refugees and the fact that right now its funding is under threat, A, of course, because of the pandemic, and B, because mainly of the U.S. funding?
First of all, I just want to thank you for having me on Indus News. I think we know that Unrwa is quite vitally important to Palestinian refugees, and that's mostly because of the political situation and the apartheid regime that's been imposed by Israel on Palestinians. For example, in Gaza, over 70% of the population there are refugees who've been displaced from other parts of Palestine, and we know that they've been under a severe blockade for over 10 years. And it's no secret that the US hasn't necessarily put Palestinian human rights and respect for international law at the heart of its foreign policy, especially when it comes to the situation for Palestinians. Instead, they've been cutting funding to Unrwa whilst continuing to provide $3.8 billion in military aid, which continues to entrench oppression on the Palestinian people. So I think Unrwa is vitally important for the Palestinians, but that's only because the political situation and the aggression towards them by Israel, and that could only be possible with the support of states like the US, countries like the US, who are continuing to fund Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people and provide them with diplomatic cover and impunity to allow them to commit war crimes without any consequences. So I think at the heart of this is demanding accountability to Israel by the international community to enforce Israel to respect international law and human rights, so that agencies like Unrwa won't be needed.
All right. If I may, Khalil, I'll ask you, the reasoning that the U.S. put forth for cutting the funding, I want to get your thoughts on that, because one of the reasons put forth was that, listen, we should just support the host countries, right? So I'll pick on Jordan for a moment, because Jordan hosts a lot of Palestinian refugees. So do you agree that, or what do you think of the fact that the U.S. thinks the support should just go to the country, the host country itself, instead of to an organization like Unrwa to then distribute it to these refugees?
Well, the rationale for this serious change in U.S. policy back in 2018 goes a bit deeper than simply trying to shift responsibility or the target of these donations from the refugees themselves to the host countries. It goes deeper in the sense that it's a very political rationale for this change in policy by the U.S. And the purpose is to eliminate the refugee problem, really. I think, even though it wasn't made very clear, but by now, the purpose of this change in policy is quite clear to all observers. And the attempt by this administration to basically imitate some radical ideas within Israel, even though Israel, since 1948, has somewhat acquiesced and actually supported at one point the work of Unrwa in order to kind of placate, if you will, or pacify the refugee population to avoid assuming responsibility over this legally, as Huda just indicated. But then all of a sudden this radical idea emerged that the best way to eliminate the issue of Palestine is really to eliminate its refugee component. If the refugees somehow were to disappear and no longer remain as an international legal issue, somehow Israel would be totally absolved from its international responsibility. It's a naive idea, it's a radical idea. But it emerged during the 2016 elections around President Trump before he was elected. And once elected, it took him a couple of years to coordinate this move. And it was essentially a blackmail against the Palestinians, trying to suffocate, all international aid and pressure other countries, not just the U.S. itself, to cut aid to the Palestinians in order to force them to settle with Israel without meeting, if you will, the legal requirements of honoring the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people to determine their own future and to have their own state.
All right, so let me stick with you, Khalil. At this point, when we're talking about UNRWA's role going forward, you spoke about the fact that the rationale at this point in time, at least back in 2018, was one that was radical, political in nature, of course, and that makes sense, certainly because the U.S. is so biased in favor of Israel. That's something that I imagine everybody across the board would agree with. Nevertheless, do you think that once this bandage is now off, that this can possibly be used as impetus, in fact, for the Palestinians to get what they want in some way?
Well, again, it's not just U.S. bias toward Israel. In a way, we got accustomed to that since 1948, but it's actually bias to even ideas within Israel that are outside of the mainstream of Israeli politics. I mean, this idea, many Israeli scholars have pointed out that trying to eliminate the refugee problem, first of all, it's stupid, it's impossible. You're talking about at least 5.6 million legally recognized refugees according to UNRWA today, plus, there are refugees who are not registered with Unrwa. So you're talking about, at least 8-9 million Palestinians who consider themselves refugees. The Palestinian number is larger than the technical Unrwa number. And if you deny them services somehow that they would disappear, you would force them to settle. The way the administration here in Washington calls it is somehow you would rehabilitate this problem and eliminate it and absolve Israel of the responsibility as the occupying power, if you will, over Palestine.
Huda, the reason I put that question the way I did to Khalil about if this could be used as impetus for the Palestinians to get what they want is because it has been spoken about a number of times that Israel, as the occupying power here, should actually take responsibility to be able to handle all of the above occupied people. So in a sense, it would then be its hand would be forced in some way. At least that's the theory. If, for example, the PA were to stop cooperating with it and the PA security forces were to stop cooperating with it, and then Unrwa were to, hypothetically, I'm just saying, collapse and or not have funding to be able to provide the needed services for all these Palestinian refugees, that would put a lot of pressure on Israel. Would that not in some way result possibly, of course, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, in a resolution of some sort of the situation?
I guess you could see it that way, but I think we've seen the reality of what Israel has done to the Palestinians having some feedback, to the Palestinians since 1948 with the Nakba ethnically cleansing over half of the Palestinian population and continuing to implement their system of ethnic cleansing on the Palestinian people since. And I think cutting funds to Unrwa is just going to help in aiding that system of ethnic cleansing by denying people the ability to access appropriate medical care, healthcare, clean water, etc. So I do see the theory behind it, but at the same time, I think we've seen enough evidence to know that Israel does not have, will not enforce a solution which is in favor of the Palestinian people, especially without sanctions and accountability by the international community. And, we've seen in Gaza for the past 10 years, several bombing attacks. In 2014, they killed over 2,200 Palestinians, including 500 children. 62 clinics and hospitals were destroyed, 45 ambulances, 250 schools, and the only civilian power plant in Gaza. And they continue to massacre protesters who are calling for the right of return, which is enshrined under international law in UN Resolution 194. And Israel just continues to have a disregard for this because it gets to act without consequences from the international community. So I think the only way we can see any just solution is with sanctions and by the international community to respond to the call for boycott, divestment and sanctions from the Palestinian people until Israel respects international law and the Palestinian human rights.
Huda, I'll give you the final fact. I just want to talk for a moment about the COVID-19 and the pandemic within the occupied territories itself and within Palestinian territories. We know the numbers now coming out of just Gaza are quite drastic. And I mean, the numbers have always been bad when it comes to employment, etc. The World Bank now saying that the poverty rate in Gaza has now reached 80%. I mean, these are numbers which are just hard to even fathom, right, for any region around the world. What kind of an impact does that then add on to the fact that Unrwa is not being able to completely do its work as it would normally do?
I think we're seeing with coronavirus, the situation in Palestine is extremely worrying. But everywhere we're seeing that it affects the people at the other end of our system of inequality in the world vastly more. So it isn't. It's a threat to those who are at the end of oppression, such as the Palestinians in Gaza, way more. And we know that it's one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. And what we know from a virus like coronavirus is that in those situations, that's when it breeds and it thrives and has severe consequences, especially where you have you've got the most densely populated area on Earth. They've been under blockade for over a decade. The infrastructure has been attacked several times by Israel, and the rebuilding of this infrastructure has been prohibited by the blockade. So for situations like this, when funding should be pummeled into the Unrwa at the fastest rate to deal with this crisis, we're seeing the opposite happening, and that's why I refer to it as just an extension of the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, because it's murder by the US cuts to UNRWA right now. But as well, we just see this as a continuation for Western states like the US and the UK, as for example, where I am, to continue to provide cover for Israel rather than holding them accountable. And a situation like this was inevitable because of what Israel has continued to do to the Palestinians.
All right, well, with that, we sincerely, of course, appreciate both Huda and Khalil for their time this morning and for sharing their insight with us and, of course, giving us their expertise. The situation in the occupied territories has been long-standing, so it's not a surprise that UNRWA plays an extremely important role, as Khalil there had mentioned, as well as Huda, that UNRWA was brought into force in 1949 and has still existed because, of course, there has not been a resolution to the main dispute itself, when the Palestinians were kicked out of their homes and Israel was established. Nevertheless, it plays an important role, of course, and provides educational opportunities, etc., even work opportunities for a lot of Palestinians. As Khalil had put it, around 5 million or so depend in some way or the other for UNRWA services or on UNRWA services. With the U.S. funding cut and the U.S. trying to force the hand of the Palestinians or to just make the refugee problem disappear altogether, as Khalil there said, UNRWA now finds itself in major trouble, where it's not being able to meet its funding goals that it needs just for this year. And this all comes as a double whammy, has hit the agency and the Palestinian people with the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And and the effects of that, of course, are playing out, as we've seen right now in Gaza, with the statistics being around 80% for unemployment. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Iraq. Now, we know that there has been, or there is, to an extent, a resurgence now, again, of ISIS in that country, of course, within the context that one would understand of what a resurgence would look like, especially after it had been announced that ISIS had been defeated. All of this comes within a situation in Iraq where that country is dealing not only with the COVID-19 pandemic, but now with a just brand new government, which was literally just approved just over the past day or so. So now the new Prime Minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, is going to now be leading the country at this point in time. Will he be able to stabilize the country enough? Will he be able to resolve the turmoil politically enough to then be able to concentrate on threats like ISIS and to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic? ISIS, on a yearly basis, around the month of Ramadan, there is a resurgence always in ISIS attacks across the country. So it's not a complete surprise that ISIS is attacking at this point in time. However, it is concerning, especially, of course, as I said, within the power vacuum that existed till just a day or so ago. Let's discuss that further. We're joined now by Kawa Hassan, who is the Vice President of Middle East and North Africa Program at East-West Institute. He's joining us now from Brussels. Joining us from Suleimania is Mohammed Hussein, who is Policy Director at the Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research, which is an independent research center. Mohammed and Kawa, thank you both for your time today. Kawa, let me start with you. What do you make of al-Kadhimi as Prime Minister? Will he be able to stabilize the country?
Thank you, Waqar. So finally, there's a new government in Iraq. That's really a good news. But whether al-Kadhimi would be able to solve all the problems Iraq is facing is really a big question mark. So this is a provisional government, probably for 1 or 2 years, and it aims to, as Kadhimi himself said, first and foremost to prepare the ground for a new election, and also at the same time to try to stabilize Iraq for not being, and that Iraq is not a theater for proxy wars, particularly between Iran and the US. Whether he will succeed, in all these aims, it's really a question mark. But and also, a third aim is to make sure that is the Iraqi government, which has control and monopoly of all weapons and violence, meaning that militias to be put under the control of the Iraqi government. Now, there might be that a good opportunity for Al-Kadhimi particularly to achieve the last aim, which is gradually to bring some of these militias under the control of the Iraqi government, since really in Iraq today there is a consensus among the main political players, but also the population, more importantly the population, that a weak state, the lack of a strong state which controls the means of violence is one of the reasons for the current instability. So there is some support for that aim within the population, within the political scene. Whether he will succeed in holding those who are responsible for killing of demonstrators, and also to also address the issue of corruption, particularly the corruption of the of the political establishment, that is a big question. When it comes to ISIS, again, the resurgence of ISIS is really very alarming, very worrying, because ISIS, it was weakened in 2018 and 19, but now it makes a comeback because of because of the fragile state of the Iraqi institutions, because of the fragmentation within the Iraqi political establishment, and also because of lack of a national plan to resettle the IDPs, but also to reconstruct the liberated areas. So all in all, big challenges for Al-Kadhimi.
Indeed. Mohammed, what are your thoughts on that? Again, back to the ISIS threat more at this point, because that's very worrying, right? I mean, the political turmoil to one side, but why do you think it is that the security forces in the country haven't been able to stem this specific resurgence of ISIS? What's gone wrong?
Thank you for having me, Waqar, and I would say hello to Mr. Kawa. As Mr. Kawa said, the resurgence of ISIS is actually affected by several factors. One of them is the political instability in Baghdad, and besides this, we have had a lot of protesters, demonstrations, and weak state institutions and weak security institutions in all the areas where the ISIS resurgences are appeared. But we should not forget also that the effects of the public health measures to contain coronavirus pandemic also overwhelmed the security forces and exhausted security forces in all the areas where the ISIS operation is happening in the past few days. And don't forget the areas where the ISIS operations are taking place is also the area that were occupied mostly by ISIS in 2014, and all these areas still war-ruined places and war-torn places, and they haven't been reconstructed. They haven't been taken care of by the national government in Baghdad, and we still have more than 1.4 million IDPs or waiting to return to their homes in this area. We still have an entire neighborhood in Mosul. A lot of villages are still leveled with the ground. So all these issues and problems politically, economically, and in security terms are creating a fertile ground for the ISIS resurgence. And we have been actually tracking the ISIS regrouping in all these areas. It's not something unexpected. It was quite expected by certain security institutions, and a lot of local media have reported that the ISIS regrouping process in all these areas, while we have political and economic reason to push local people again opening door for ISIS militants and ISIS insurgents in certain places and areas. So the same reasons that created ISIS and brought ISIS to Iraq in 2014, actually most of the reasons are still there in terms of politically discriminated local community like Arab Sunnis, in terms of having fragile and weak state institutions in the national level, in terms of the economic problems and lack of job opportunities. All these reasons are still working strongly to bring, if not ISIS, another like-minded insurgent groups or extremist groups.
All right, so Kawa, that's a very good point, actually. What do you think about whether now Iraq's governance system is better placed than it was in 2014 to be able to deal with that situation? Do you think that now the Iraqi establishment can finally say, okay, now we've understood that these areas need attention, as Mohammed there said they have not yet gotten? Do you think that that the establishment as a whole will make that decision, or do you think that they'll just continue with the status quo as they have with their internal squabbling? Because, of course, as we know, there is that sectarian, essentially, quota system still in place.
Unfortunately not. Until this moment, the answer is negative. The fact that ISIS is resurging, it means that the political establishment has failed to learn the lessons of the previous expansion of ISIS. The problem of corruption of the political establishment is as strong and as destructive as ever. Yes, there has been some progress in terms of resettlement of refugees, and I think so far until April 30th or March 30th, 4.6 million IDPs, refugees, have been resettled. That's a good news, but as Mr. Mohammed said, there is still 1.4 million IDPs in IDP camps waiting to be resettled, and these IDP camps are actually one of the excellent places for expansion of ISIS destructive sectarian ideology. In a way, they might be the perfect university for graduation of ISIS, ISIS militants, because of lack of a national plan as how to reconstruct the liberated areas, because of lack of consensus at the political level about a reconstruction strategy, but also because of a lack of coordination between the different security and intelligence services which are responsible for the security in those areas, and of course, and more importantly, because of a lack of a local security structure which is trusted by the local people.
Okay, so Mohammed, on top of all of this, then we have the challenge of COVID-19 as well. That's something that obviously no government around the world could have foreseen, but do you think that that adds a disadvantage again for the Iraqi government, for Iraqi security forces as well, to be able to deal with ISIS or with all the other challenges that the country faces? I mean, that's a huge challenge in and of itself, isn't it?
It is indeed a huge challenge, but the thing is, we are actually struggling with the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic more than it is health implications. So far, Iraqi people and the Iraqi health institutions have experienced a good, let's say, approach with the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's okay and it's better than the neighboring countries in terms of the reported infected cases. But the problem is the economic implications of the COVID-19, and as you have heard, the oil price crash as a result of the COVID-19, which actually left Iraqi federal government and Iraqi economy generally with a huge financial crisis. This financial crisis is gonna affect the performance of security forces, of course, in this area. It's gonna affect the whole Iraqi government institutions in this area, and this weak governing system and governing structure in the fragile areas, or let's say in the areas with a lot of ISIS operations, it will be alarming, and it will be a big challenge for all the national governments in Baghdad and local governments in the provinces where they are handling ISIS crisis and ISIS threats. So I would say, yeah, the COVID-19 driving economic crisis and financial crisis are really a big challenge for Iraqi government, Iraqi even private sector, and people generally.
Okay, so Kawa, then this goes back to then the point that you had made earlier, right, about the proxy wars that have played out on Iraqi soil, because correct me if I'm wrong, but naturally then in such a situation where the country is going through both economic problems as well as security problems, the establishment will need to turn to some external player, right? So be it the Iranians, be it the Americans, or be it somebody else altogether, whoever will come in will obviously want their own influence. And so we're sort of back to square one, aren't we?
Well, what we are seeing right now is a new dynamic, I would say. At the moment, Iran is really preoccupied with, fighting corona pandemic in Iran itself, and it has a huge, huge impact on the economic situation in Iran. In addition to that, after the killing of General Qasem Soleimani and the Iraqi the leader of PMF, Popular Mobilization Unit, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, Iran is still trying to fill that void. And because Qasem Soleimani had, enormous influence in Iraq and good relations with all key political players across the board. So they are still trying to fill that vacuum. So Iran, in a way, is preoccupied with its own internal problems, partly as a result of COVID, but also partly as a result of the killing of General Qasem Soleimani. At the same time, U.S. is also preoccupied with addressing the spread of coronavirus in the U.S., but also you hear from certain circles in Washington, particularly from the, let's say, more from the conservative side, a kind of Iraq fatigue that, we have been helping Iraqis for the last 17 years, and look what we have, look at the situation today, that, you have groups who are really pro-Iran and who are very powerful. And in a sense, there is this Iraq fatigue in Washington. And so what we see is there is somehow a space for Iraqi leaders to take initiative and try to build up a balanced relation between these two groups, these two powers. At the same time, you're right, you need an international or regional player to support you in your attempts to address these multiple crises. But the point is that these two key players are preoccupied with their own problems. At the same time, they have completely two divergent strategic aims when it comes to Iraq and how they perceive Iraq's stability and security. And in that sense, it's worrying that there is a less and less interest in internationally to fight ISIS, and also to help Iraq economically because of partly also because of the structural problems with Iraq's economy and the corruption of the political class post-2003. So there is less interest in supporting Iraq, and also the collapsing oil prices has had really destructive impact and will continue to have destructive impact on Iraq's politics.
All right, so then, Mohammed, what are your thoughts on that? Because to me, then, it seems like, Mohammed, and you can correct me again if I'm wrong, but it seems like this may not be a bad thing in the sense that, do you think that the Iraqis will finally think, okay, we need to resolve our situation on our own and should not be relying on any other party, external party, I mean, be it the Iranians, the Americans, or anybody else? Could this in some way be a good thing for the establishment?
It's absolutely a good thing for the establishment and for the whole stability in Iraq. And as I heard last night from the Prime Minister Mustafa Kazemi's government program, he's actually pursuing a balancing relationship with both United States and Iran, and trying to keep Iraq neutral in their conflict and also enjoying normal relationship with both sides. And it tells like a very good signal about how would be the mind picture of the Iraqi foreign relations in the next stage. But don't forget that most of the Iraqi problems, especially security problems like ISIS, it's not just Iraqi problems alone. It is Iranian problems, US problems, the whole international community's problems. Yeah. So those countries and those regional players should not leave Iraq alone to struggle with its ISIS or with its security challenges in the rural areas and provinces like Anbar, Nainawa, and Salahuddin. I mean, the international community's cooperation is quite necessary, and I don't think the Iraqi leaders would try to avoid asking the international alliances and the regional alliances to help Iraqis in fighting the ISIS and the other security problems, because at the end of the day, that would be a problem for everyone, not just Iraqi government or Iraqi people. But it's true, we basically need to have a normal balancing relationship with everyone, all the neighboring countries and all the regional and international players, including Iran and the United States, because those international players' conflict over Iraqi territory and in Iraq has become a very, very big distraction for the previous cabinets. And I am sure the Prime Minister Kazemi is trying hard to avoid such a problem and to get in the same trouble that Adil Abdul Mahdi experienced with the past cabinet.
Very well. All right, we'll have to leave there as our final word. Unfortunately, the clock has gotten at us, but we do sincerely appreciate both Kawa and Mohammed for the context they've provided and the expertise they've shared with us for us to try to understand a bit better about the very complex situation within Iraq as the country faces many, many challenges. It's not just ISIS, right? It's also COVID-19. It's also the economic situation that has arisen because of COVID-19, corruption within the ruling class, the entire quota system that was put in place, mind you, ever since the U.S. took over the country, really, after the fall of Saddam Hussein. There has been this system in place which is just not serving the people. And as Mohammed there laid out as well, those areas where we're seeing ISIS resurgence are places which have not been given attention by successive Iraqi governments, really. So it's no surprise that we're seeing ISIS rise from those areas. And as Kawa there had also mentioned, there are so many IDPs and camps strewn across the country, but in specific camps, specifically also in the north of the country, that seems to be fertile ground for ISIS to come in and to sort of brainwash people and to give them then food and shelter, etc., so that they come onto their side in this entire situation. And that can be, as Mohammed said, a problem for the entire region, for all regional countries as well as global countries. If we see a resurgence of ISIS from Iraq, that is a threat to all of us around the world. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.